Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for your invitation, or at least whoever was involved in making the decision. Hopefully, no one will regret it. The United Kingdom and the United States share a long and rich history of vigorous public discourse over trade policy. Clashes over trade fueled many of the great debates between Hamilton and Jefferson in the early years of the American Republic, between Gladstone and Disraeli in the Victorian era, and between Churchill and Joseph Chamberlain in the early 1900s, as well as between Republican and Democratic parties from the Civil War until the Second World War. By the end of the Cold War, however, the tenor of these debates gradually died down. By the 1990s, Republicans and Democrats in the United States and Tories and New Labourites in the UK agreed that free trade had prevailed over protectionism. Trade policy safely could be put on autopilot. And to the extent that there were details to be worked out, that would be done by bureaucrats in places like Geneva and Brussels. It turned out, however, that history stubbornly refused to end. Globalization has made many of us richer, but it has presented us with enormous challenges. The costs have fallen disproportionately on working people, those who live just beyond the reach of society's safety net, but outside the thriving technology and financial services hubs that have driven much of the economic growth in the United States and the UK over the last 2 decades. In recent years, these developments have upended our politics and revived long dormant debates about trade policy and its role in our society. This is a positive development, in my view. Trade policy should be debated with verve, grounded in facts, and adjusted from time to time as circumstances warrant. A trade policy forged in the crucible of domestic positions and politics better accords with our democratic values than one dictated by experts in multinational organizations. Such a policy is less likely to be met with popular backlash and overreaction, and over time, I believe it will lead to better outcomes for more of our citizens. All too often, however, debates over trade quickly descend into the stale, reductionist paradigm of free trade versus protectionism. This is unfortunate. We should start with the more fundamental question I ask you to ponder with me this evening. What should be the objective of trade policy? Some view trade policy as an extension of international relations and see free trade as a recipe for perpetual peace. The argument is that trade fosters interdependencies between nations, which in turn raise the cost of armed conflict and therefore make conflicts less likely. And history has vindicated this view, except when it has not. The United States lowered trade barriers in the late 1940s, in part to help Western European and Japanese economies recover from the devastation of World War II. That policy was successful in achieving its objective and undoubtedly contributed to post-war security. Likewise, the tearing down of trade barriers within Europe, starting with the European coal and steel community and culminating in the Maastricht Treaty, surely is among the reasons why guns have been silent on the plains of Belgium and France since 1945. But there are contrary examples. Economic ties between northern and southern United States did not prevent them from going to war in 1861. Global trade grew rapidly in the years right before World War I. Exports as a percent of global GDP peaked at nearly 14% in 1913. a record that would hold until the 1970s. Moreover, it would be hard to argue that the rise of Germany as a major exporter in the late 19th century helped to pacify that country in the 20th. China's accession to the WTO, we were told, would cause it to become a model global citizen. That was followed by massive investments in military capability and territorial expansion in the South China Sea. On the flip side, conflict over trade is not always destabilizing. The NATO alliance survived the tariff hikes associated with both the Chicken War of the 1960s and the Nixon shock of the 1970s. There was considerable tension in the trade relations between the United States and Japan in the 1980s, but that didn't cause our security alliance to unravel. Nations, like individuals, can and do compartmentalize their relations with others. My point is not that foreign policy considerations should play no role whatsoever in trade policy, only that it is wrong to assume a linear correlation between free trade and lasting peace. The world is far more complicated than that. Foreign policy mavens should have the humility to accept it as such. Economists, on the other hand, view trade policy as a way to optimize the most intangible of objects, social welfare. Optimizing social welfare seems solely to mean eliminating the inefficiencies in the production and distribution of goods and services. How policies that increase economic efficiency affect the lives and livelihoods of those who do the producing and the distributing has little or no bearing on this calculus. Where trade is concerned, optimizing social welfare points in only one direction: the elimination of all tariffs and non-tariff barriers in trade. But optimizing social welfare, as economists use that term, is not the same thing as maximizing the welfare of society. It is the latter objective, enduring a prosperous, well-ordered society consisting of responsible citizens, intact families, and safe and stable communities, that matters most to ordinary citizens. Particular trade policy choices should flow, in my view, from a clear-eyed assessment of what will best advance that objective at any given time, and not from abstract reasoning in some economic textbook. So how has trade policy of the post-Cold War era affected communities in the United States and Britain? Trade liberalization has caused the profits of many multinational corporations to soar. This has benefited not only CEOs, but also shareholders who, in the United States at least, increasingly are middle-income people who hold equities in their retirement accounts. Many of America's great urban centers, which had fallen into decay in the 1970s, have been revived. Cheap imports are available to the masses, and across the globe, millions have been lifted out of poverty in China, India, and throughout the developing world. Yet the dark side is undeniable. Between 2000 and 2016, the United States lost nearly 5 million manufacturing jobs. At the same time, real medium household income stagnated. The story was largely the same thing in the United Kingdom. This country lost 20% of its manufacturing jobs between 2007 and 2016. London and the home counties flourished, while other parts of the country suffered. In places prosperity left behind, the fabric of society has frayed. In the mid-1990s, the United States has faced an epidemic of so-called deaths of despair among working-class adults who lack a college education, the very same group that has borne the brunt of outsourcing. Among members of this demographic, cirrhosis of the liver is up 50% since 1999. Drug and alcohol overdoses are up over 323%, and deaths by suicide are up 78%. From 2015 to 2017, the increase in deaths of despair led to the first decrease in the life expectancy in the United States over a 3-year period since the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918. Trade was not the sole cause of the loss of manufacturing jobs, nor the attendant society distress. Automation, productivity gains, currency manipulation, and of course the financial crisis played key roles as well. But we cannot deny that the outsourcing of jobs from high to low wage jurisdictions has had major devastating effects on communities in the American Rust Belt, as well as in the former British manufacturing hubs of the Midlands, the north of England, and many parts of Scotland. Of course, economic upheaval is the price we pay for progress. And in theory, economists insist, comparative advantage causes workers to migrate to more productive and often higher paying jobs. But this Ricardian ideal has failed to materialize in recent years. Unlike in earlier periods of economic change, the options for displaced workers in the modern developed economies typically are fewer and less attractive. In the 19th century Britain, for example, the repeal of the Corn Laws prompted agricultural workers to flee the countryside to urban areas where factory jobs were waiting. By contrast, this displaced workers of today either have nowhere to go or end up working in low-skilled, low-paying services jobs. British and American voters have sought policy responses to these developments for years. The political left has answered with ever more generous social welfare schemes designed to distribute the largesse of globalization's winners to its losers. Many on the right have relied on rote and at times callous incantations of Bentham. Cheap t-shirts and big screen TVs for the masses are worth the loss of good paying jobs and stable communities. Neither response is satisfactory. Both ignore the inherent dignity of work and the effect that gainful employment has on making human beings better parents, spouses, neighbors, and citizens. Until quite recently, no one in the political mainstream was willing to defy the free trade consensus and suggest that the rules of trade need to be adjusted. That, of course, was until Donald J. Trump descended on his escalator in the summer of 2015. The president's view was that we need a whole-of-government approach to bring stable, good-paying jobs back to the United States, in particular manufacturing jobs. Trade and regulatory policies were crucial components of this strategy, but trade policy had a role to play as well. The desire to reverse the offshoring of manufacturing jobs is not motivated simply by nostalgia for the America of the 1950s and the 1960s. It is based on a recognition that a country as large as the United States, or the UK for that matter, needs a robust manufacturing sector if it wants to support a large, thriving middle class. The United States has an adult population of roughly 250 million people. Over half of them lack a college diploma. Historically, manufacturing jobs have been the best source of well-paying, stable employment for those in this cohort. Some say that rather than seek to revive manufacturing, countries like the US and the UK instead should double down on the digital economy, research and development, and the services sector. There are several problems with this argument. The digital economy is a source of competitive strength for both of our countries, but it is not a source of high-paying jobs for working people. Perhaps the massive new investment in education, we could teach former auto workers to code. but it's doubtful we'll have the jobs to employ them. Today's leading technology companies employ far fewer people than the industrial behemoths that they replaced at the top of the economic food chain. Facebook, Apple, Netflix, and Google, 4 companies that have driven much of the growth in the American stock market in recent years, collectively employed just over 300,000 people. That's less than half the number of people who worked for General Motors in the 1960s. Moreover, workers in the technology and services sector are themselves increasingly vulnerable to outsourcing. Economists have estimated that nearly 40 million service sector jobs in the United States could be offshored in the future. That's more than 3 times the current number of manufacturing jobs in our country. Our loss of manufacturing jobs has coincided with skyrocketing trade deficits. Of course, part of the accepted dogma of the economic profession is that trade deficits are harmless and must be ignored. I agree that a given bilateral trade deficit in a given year is not necessarily cause for concern. But when a country's overall trade deficit in goods reaches, say, $866 billion, as ours did last year, it is reasonable to ask whether that is just the hidden hand at work or whether unfair and market-distorting trade practices are also to blame. One familiar trope of the free trade apologists use is to dismiss the importance of trade deficits by saying, I run a trade deficit with my barber, both of us are better off as a result. Therefore, trade deficits are inherently benign. True enough in the case of the barber, but not so if I run a deficit with the barber, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and everyone with whom I transact, including my employer. Moreover, academic theory cannot hide the basic fact that if a country imports goods that it could produce domestically, that means domestic spending is employing people abroad rather than at home. This trade-off might be worth it, especially if there are offsetting benefits in the forms of export-related jobs. But when imbalances are the result of currency manipulation, lack of reciprocity and market access, unfair labor practices, subsidies, or other market-distorting schemes, it is reasonable to seek adjustments in the rules of trade in order to correct those imbalances. At this point, I have framed the problem, but I have yet to answer how trade policy should be changed to better serve the needs of working people. I'm afraid I cannot offer a grand, unified theory, but that's part of my point. Trade policy should not be dictated by abstract theories or orthodoxies. Trade policy should be ruthlessly pragmatic, guided only by a desire to advance the interests of people and communities that we represent. Contrary to what some of our critics have charged, the United States under President Trump's leadership has not drifted towards protectionism. We have not raised tariffs across the board, nor have we sought to unwind our trading relationships. Instead, we have identified unfair trade practices and unbalanced trade agreements that we believe have led to American job losses, and then we have sought to correct using all tools available, dialogue when possible, remedies at the WTO where available, but also unilateral trade actions when necessary. First, we sought to renegotiate a series of badly outdated, unbalanced free trade agreements, which have contributed greatly to the loss of manufacturing jobs. The most important of these was the North American Free Trade Agreement. Before President Trump was elected, 8 of the last 11 automobile plants built in North America had been built in Mexico. That imbalance had very little to do with market forces, but instead was driven by Mexico's industrial policy of attracting manufacturing investment through low wages. In fact, wages in Mexico are lower today in real terms than they were in 1994 when NAFTA entered into force. Wages have been kept low in large part due to so-called protection contracts negotiated by non-democratic unions. In addressing the imbalance in the NAFTA, we sought and obtained fundamental change in our trading relationship with Mexico and Canada. We did not seek to tear apart that relationship or seek to undo 25 years of integration within the North American economies. Instead, we identified the causes of the key imbalance and negotiated commitments that would address them. The new United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is a major breakthrough, and I would argue one of the first serious attempts by policymakers to find a sensible middle path between unrestrained globalism and old-school protectionism. By far, however, our most significant challenge was our troubling relationship with China. In 2000, President Bill Clinton told Americans that as a result of China joining the WTO, the United States would, quote, be able to export products to China without exporting jobs. It turns out he was wrong. Our trade deficit with China ballooned to almost $500 billion, and economists calculated that nearly a third of the 5 million manufacturing jobs that we lost was attributed to the so-called China shock. During this time, China ramped up a policy of forced technology transfer, which not only resulted in the theft of billions of dollars in U.S. intellectual property, but also helped China become the world's top exporter of high technology products. The two prior administrations sought to correct these problems through dialogue and litigation at the WTO, with little or no success. Rather than repeat failed tactics, we took a different approach. We spent much of the first year of the administration investigating China's history of IP theft and forced technology transfer. We documented those abuses in a 200-page report. Where the WTO rules provide a remedy, we filed a WTO action. But where the WTO rules do not provide an adequate means for redress, we use remedies available under our own trade laws. Again, we did not act rashly or arbitrarily. We carefully identified products made by Chinese companies that had benefited from China's unfair trade practices. We then used careful analysis to identify products that could be tariffed without causing substantial pain to U.S. consumers. The result was a list of products on which we imposed a 25% duty. Roughly, that counteracts the unfair trade advantage China has obtained. But contrary to the dire predictions across the commentariat, this conflict did not spiral out of control and wreck the global economy. The United States and China had candid discussions about the problem in our relationship and found solutions that soothed tensions. Much work remains to be done, but our Phase 1 agreement represents real progress and hopefully establishes a framework through which the world's two largest economies can resolve their differences in a mutually respectful and beneficial way going forward. It bears noting that even with all the trade actions we have taken over the past 2 years, the United States remains, in fact, the world's most open economy. Our weighted average tariff rate for imports was 1.5% during the last year of the Obama administration, 1.5%. In 2019, despite the new tariffs we imposed, our trade weighted average was only 2.85%. That remains below Europe's 3.0% applied MFN tariff. The net result of our policy is that trade is up, not down. Total U.S. goods trade in goods and services was up 14% between 2016 and 2019. At times, we have broken the shibboleths of the free trade religion but we have done so selectively and responsibly. We have engaged in honest, good faith negotiations with our trading partners that has resulted in fair agreements that I believe will facilitate more trade and place our trading relationship on a more stable and enduring foundation for the future. How countries like the United Kingdom and the United States can harness the benefits of globalization and technology change in a way that improves the lives of working people is one of the most important challenges of our day. The answers are not easy, but I have been encouraged in recent years by work of academics and policymakers that have tried to grapple seriously with these questions. I sincerely hope that as a result of our conversation this evening, some of the bright minds here in this room will join their ranks. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for your remarks and for coming to the Union today. We're all so excited for this event. I wanted to start by asking if you can comment a bit further on the US-China decoupling that we're seeing and what this means for the rest of the world.
First of all, you start with your analysis has to start with we have a serious problem, we the West, not just the United States, with China and China's model, all right? For us, it's manifested itself in an almost $500 billion trade deficit. The question then becomes, what do you do about it? Years ago, it was probably possible that one could make a decision to decouple. I do not believe that's possible at this point. We did that, just analytically, we did that in the case of the Soviet Union, recall, but that was a small economy and there were a lot of other things going on. I think now what we have to do is develop rules that benefit both of us and that over time, the inherent advantages in our system will prevail. So I do not believe there is some level of companies making a different analysis, but there's not a decoupling, number one. And number two, that's not our objective. Our objective is to develop rules, ideally with the West, but if not that individually, with China that will allow both of us to prosper and then just see which system prevails.
And then on the topic of China, the coronavirus that originated there is getting worse globally day by day. Can you talk to us a bit about what this means for global trade over the next few months and the next year?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on the coronavirus, so it's hard for me to say. Clearly, it's having an impact now. In terms of our phase one trade agreement, there is no reason to believe that China won't do everything that they said they were going to do. I mean, we'll have enforcement issues and the like, but they have not come to us and said we want out of our commitments because of that virus. My view is if the virus is going to be something that goes on for years, then it's going to have a substantial effect. If it's going to be something that, as some believe, will be handled in the next few months, and then it'll be the global economy will absorb it, and we'll move forward. So it's not something that I think is going to fundamentally affect the relationship between the United States and China.
And now, as we're in the UK, what can we expect from the US-UK trade deal?
Oh, well, that's trickier, right? So we just saw your negotiating objectives today. The process will start in the next few weeks. We'll see. There's no reason to think that we won't have a successful deal, right? Our systems are very similar. Everybody has some things they're worried about here and there. That always comes up. But we have relatively balanced trade. And I expect a good outcome after a substantial negotiation.
And Trump also just finished a visit to India. Can you talk us through what we can expect from a US-India trade package?
Well, we have a negotiation ongoing with India. Our hope was that we would have a phase one deal there. For those of you who really are into the details, we have a preference system called the Generalized System of Preferences, which allows developing countries to get the benefit of selling into the United States without paying any duties. In the case of India, we took that away a year ago because they didn't keep their end of the bargain. They denied us access, in our opinion. A negotiation to restore that has been going on for the last several months. We've made headway, but not enough headway that we could actually sign a deal. Our hope is to do that as a phase one deal and then begin the process, which will be a difficult process, of a free trade agreement with India. Those of you who know anything about the India economy, it's a very, very statist economy. They have the highest tariffs in the world. So and they have a very, very entrenched bureaucracy that has its own ideas. Having said that, entering into an agreement that frees up trade between the United States and India is clearly in India's interest. Breaking up that cabal of high tariffs and high tariff barriers is in the interest of India, in my judgment. And I think an agreement between the United States and India that's a real free trade agreement would be helpful for both of us.
You also talked a lot in your remarks about how to set trade policy so it can better serve the working people. However, just looking at another issue, how much of a priority is combating climate change and preserving the environment when drafting and negotiating trade deals?
So, a good example to get to your answer is the trade agreement that I and my staff negotiated with China. If I had tried to solve all the problems of the world between the United States and China in that trade agreement, we would never have a trade agreement. So you're asking me, what's the effect of climate change? Clearly, we, to the extent we can, want to put real environmental provisions in these agreements, and we have in our US, Canada, Mexico agreement. So for sure we have done that. But we're not going to solve climate change in trade agreements. Somebody's going to have to solve climate change in some other agreement. We want to have sensible environmental provisions, but when the trade agreements are all done, there'll still be petulance and other problems all over the world. So we don't want to be so ambitious that we don't make progress on real things that'll help real working people. Hold all that up in order to accomplish another goal.
But looking at this from a long-term perspective, surely combating climate change is also a real goal that we should sort of keep in mind.
Yeah, listen, I think the environment is something clearly we have to worry about. And for a lot of people, that's the number one thing they worry about. For me, the number one thing I worry about is the effect of trade on working people. I just have a different priority. I'm not saying that priority is wrong. I'm just saying it's just not what I'm worried about. I'm going to try to worry about something else. Our approach is to trade policy, and this is the point I was trying to make, it's not just economic efficiency, although that's something you should think about. But it's what's the actual effect on real people on a day-to-day basis. And we have an obligation in the United States to take care of our people, and the people over here are going to take care of their people. And I think if people are prosperous, live happy lives in their families, in their communities, the rest of these problems can be dealt with more easily.
Thank you. We will move to the audience now for some questions, just so there's enough time for all of you to get your questions in. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for the microphone to come to you, and please stand up while asking your question. And can we start with the member in the back row?
Thank you very much for your lucid presentation. President Trump is known for preferring to negotiate bilaterally. But I wonder, since many of the behaviors that you mention have irked the United States from China, are complaints that the Europeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the others may share. So I'm wondering what the logic was behind choosing to pursue the negotiation with China largely bilaterally, and whether moving forward the Trump administration would be interested in building sort of an international coalition around certain norms about what behaviors we'd like to expect from China. Thank you.
So that's a really good question, and I appreciate it. First of all, the question is, should we work with allies to try to deal with the problem, which is China, and which is this competition between what we all think of as an economic model and what they maybe not all of us, but most of us think of as and what they think of as an economic model. We have worked with our allies. We have a trilateral group with the European Commission representative, and maybe that'll be extended now since the UK is no longer in Europe, and the Japanese representative. So we have a meeting. We meet several times a year, and we work together. But when you're the biggest economy in the world and you are by far the most negatively affected, you cannot operate in a situation where you don't act in your own best interests when necessary. So I would say, first of all, there's fundamental agreement between, at least between those parties, which are the biggest economies in the world, that there's a problem. It's very difficult for Europe to make specific decisions to do things, right? Everybody who's studied that, presumably some of you are, they have 27 of them, and they have vetoes in various cases, and it's very hard. So they're a good ally, but you can't let the fact that they can't coalesce around a course of action keep us from acting. The Japanese are easier to come to a conclusion, and they're very concerned with China. But on the other hand, they're not going to lead in this area. So we are acting in a trilateral basis, a multilateral basis, but we can't let that dictate whether or not we act. And for the United States, I agree with the president's position. We are better off negotiating bilaterally. Now, if I were Switzerland, I wouldn't have that view. But we are a $22 trillion economy. If you look back over the last years, the growth in global GDP is very much related to the United States trade deficit, right? So the United States has, as I said, an $866 billion trade deficit. That is, I mean, that's bigger by far than the GDP of most countries in the world. And that deficit has, in fact, in my judgment, driven a lot of global growth, particularly in the developing world, particularly in China for that matter. And I have had former very senior government officials, including prime ministers, come to me and say privately, only the United States can actually resolve this issue. And you have to do it. The United States has to do it. Now, it's fair to say, if you're not from the United States, is the way you're doing it putting the rest of us at a disadvantage? And I would suggest that's really not the case. If you look at the undertakings that China has in this case, except for the purchases, which we can set aside, but the basic structural undertakings, all of those things will benefit the entire world if China does what it's supposed to do. And remember also, this is just a phase one. To the extent we can move forward multilaterally, we clearly want to do that too. There's an effort to do it at the WTO. And if you're thinking about the WTO, there is just one little fundamental problem of dealing with China through WTO rules. And that is that any rule change you want to make that would effectively deal with forced technology transfer and cyber theft and all this stuff would have to be agreed to by China. And it seems unlikely that they're going to agree to rules that are not in their own short-term interest. So what I would say is we're working with our allies. We're trying to bring the rest of the world with us, and in many cases, we're trying to go with the rest of the world because they're ahead of us in terms of analysis of this. But actually solving the problem is going to be a peculiarly American enterprise.
Thank you. Could we go to the member in the first row? Yeah. Sorry, could you just wait for the mic? The mic, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your talk. My question is about the development of artificial intelligence in the future and how you think it may affect manufacturing jobs, but also higher paid jobs like lawyers or bankers. Thank you very much.
Well, so the question for those of you who didn't hear it is, what effect is artificial intelligence going to have on manufacturing jobs? We have had developments in manufacturing, affect manufacturing jobs for years and years and years and years and years. I mean, technology has been a driving force in manufacturing. It does not necessarily mean that you should get out of the manufacturing business, and I think that's part of my point. In terms of artificial intelligence, there's a competition, obviously, between us, all of us, and China. And the United States is engaging in that. The United States is developing a strong program, and so are a lot of other countries, and sort of the UK, so that they can put in place and so have the best technology available. the implications of artificial intelligence are vast, not only for manufacturing and job creation, but also for national security. So the United States is focusing very much on it, and so fortunately are a lot of other people who have our collective system. But I don't think that it's necessarily going to mean that we're not going to have manufacturing jobs going forward. I just fundamentally don't believe that. I think we have to manage artificial intelligence and realize the same thing we did before. What's the purpose of our policy? And the purpose of our policy should be better, safer communities. So I don't know if that answers your question or not. It's a big priority for the United States and something that we're all very concerned about. And it's not just AI. There are a lot of other technologies that are real breakthrough technologies, and it's a little bit like the Industrial Revolution, which is what you're thinking. There is an element of that, I think, right now going on.
Could we go to the other member in the first row?
Hi, my name is Rahul. So my question is about, you spoke about the Indo-US relationship, and one irritant in that relationship for a long time has been India's treatment of big pharma in the intellectual property context. Especially I'm thinking of the US 301 procedure that India thinks is unfairly used against it whenever it tries to use its IP law flexibilities. In which are designed to foster public health interests. So what, according to you, what is your assessment of it, and what are the red lines, in your opinion, that India should be mindful of when addressing the public health needs of its citizens in the context of patent law?
Well, I would say in the first place, I'm not aware of any 301 that we've brought. We haven't brought actions against India in this area, but we do have substantial problems with India developing adequate intellectual property protection rules. It is our view that adequate intellectual property enforcement leads to innovation rather than away from innovation, right? That has to be your starting point. And that's the position we do. Among the things we talk to India about are medical devices and how they price the medical devices. There are a few cases where they, and this is really quite technical, where they have tried to get pharmaceutical companies to give away their intellectual property for licenses in India, but it hasn't been a substantial part of the disagreement between the two countries. The biggest problems we have with India are its very, very high tariffs and its non-tariff barriers to entry really right across the board. And as I say, I don't think those things are in India's interest either, right? I mean, it's not in India's interest to have that close of an economy.
Could we go to the member in the first row?
Given the differing food standards between the EU and the US, how do you think the UK should sort of deal with the sort of chlorinated chicken problem that's been quite a significant news story in sort of recent months?
So the old chlorinated chicken problem. It'll make everyone happy to know that we don't spray chlorine on our chicken, so we can take that off the table. There are vinegar-type washes that we use and that others in Europe and the UK also use, for example, on lettuce and vegetables and the like. So, but to take a step back, because I know that was just an example. Number one, it's our hope that the UK develops their own standards and doesn't just adopt Europe's standards, which in many cases are thinly veiled protectionism. So the objective should be this. Number one, the standards in the food safety area should be science-based, and to the extent you have tastes, it's a labeling question. So there's no question that the United States has a world-class health safety system, right? I mean, anybody who tells you the contrary is just being foolish, right? I mean, we have one as good as anyone in the world, and if you don't like certain kinds of products that are safe, then that's a labeling issue. It's consumer preference. And you can go through here and say, I don't want this, I don't want that. I will say this, I've had lots of meals in the United States with lots of Europeans, and a lot of them ate chicken. And none of them got sick. Most of them were very happy, and it goes just as well with white wine as it does over here. So I think that's a bit of a kind of a false problem. Science-based standards, and then consumer preference. That's what's going to sort out this problem. And the United States and the UK are not going to go separate ways based on chicken, that I can tell you. Or either one of us being chicken, I guess.
Could we go to the member in the, yeah, can you stand up?
So you already mentioned the UK releasing their negotiating objectives, and alongside that, I think the Department for International Trade's put out its scoping assessments on what
it's what assessment, could you?
Or its scoping assessments on the potential UK-US FTA.
Right.
And so in that, it talked about, I think it was a upper bound of a 0.16% boost to UK GDP, 0.05% to the US. So lower numbers than have been in discourse, and I think something like 8% predicted boost to bilateral UK-US trade. So are those the kind of numbers that people on your side are getting, do you know? And also, do you think that the administration has perhaps been overstating the potential impact of such an FTA? So like Mike Pence talked in the UK a few months ago about trade going up 5 or 6-fold in the case of an FTA.
Well, we've done a lot of deals in the U.S., and I've been doing it for a long, long time. And I would say one thing you can be fairly certain of is whatever numbers people come up with, they're not going to be accurate, right? It is really, we talked about science-based food standards. This is like non-science-based. It's hard for us to quantify. Clearly, it will have an impact. Things that would mitigate in favor of it not being huge are, number one, we already have a great trade relationship. We have an enormous amount of investments, and probably half of all of our manufacturing goods trade is already duty-free, right? So that the way they make that calculation, that cuts it down. On the other hand, having better access to a $22 trillion economy than, for example, Europe has, will have a substantial impact on trade going forward. I guess what I'm saying is, our view is we argue the numbers when they help us, and we argue against them when they don't, based on our policies. Most of us have to believe that a free trade agreement between the UK and the United States is essential to both of us, well, particularly for the UK in fairness, because your economy is about $2.8 trillion, right? I mean, it's a good-sized economy, but it's about, ours is about 8.5 times bigger, right? So we have a larger economy. Having better access to it is really essential. And when they calculate those numbers, they tend to be just based on tariff reductions. So they tend to be smaller because of the way the model works. But if you take a step back and think what's going to happen, both of us integrating more into each other's economy has to be really, really important. And to the extent, at least in our case, we don't do it with other people, it'll be even more important for the UK. So I would be careful about using those numbers, is what I'm saying. Analytically, the UK will have better access in, by far the largest economy in the world. And that's got to be good for business. It's got to be good for jobs. And also we're locking in a lot of services rules, what they wouldn't necessarily give you credit for in the model, but it's a huge area of competitive advantage for both of us. So locking in those rules are going to make the whole world, are going to make everybody kind of live more and more by our rules. So I don't want to get tied up in that. Now, having said that, when the numbers were in my favor, I would argue them. So.
Could we go to the member in the orange shirt in the third row?
Ready. Thank you for coming. I was wondering if you could answer from the Chinese side, actually. What do you think constitutes realistic success in the trade talks? And also, how do you think this has changed throughout the process of the negotiations?
So the question is what's the Chinese objective? So picture yourself as a country that sells us $550 billion worth of stuff and that buys from us about $100 or $120 billion worth of stuff. Having access to the market is a success, right? So from China's point of view, they want to have access to our market. Now, I would suggest that when you analyze these things, you have to ask yourself this, because of what I did at the beginning. When you say China, who do you mean, right? You have to always think of that. Is it hardliners or is it what passes for a reformer in China? If you're someone who's a reformer in China, everything we're asking for is in China's interest, right? Everything that we want, every structural change will make the Chinese economy better from their point of view. If you're a hardliner, everything we're asking for is bad. So I entered into the negotiation assuming that the people who are making the decisions in my space are at least what they think of as reformers. If not, we're just going to be in a struggle forever. If they are, empowering those people is good for China in the way we all analyze things. So number one, China wants to maintain access, and number two, if you're in fact a reformer, you want to do the things. You want to have intellectual property. You want to stop technology transfer. You want to get rid of a lot of there's all kinds of SPS problems and all kinds of other barriers to trade that they're going to tear down as a result of that. All of that stuff is in China's interest if you think the way we think and the way reformers in China think.
Could we go just right behind you to the member in the fourth row?
So it was reported recently that Donald Trump had instructed the trade representatives to have drug pricing with the NHS, particularly in relation to intellectual property and the pharmaceutical lobby in the US, to be like a priority for negotiations for the FTA. How do you see that having an impact on the British healthcare system, and how would you describe the US trade representatives' intentions in terms of tackling the issue of maintaining our different approaches to pharmaceutical intellectual property?
Well, I would say, first place, the United States and the United Kingdom have similar developed intellectual property protection systems. Now, we'll have to get together and work everything out, but it's not like we're dealing with a country that doesn't already respect intellectual property. The UK does, and it has an enormous amount of intellectual property that it has every interest in protecting itself. So I'm really not troubled by that. There'll be technical problems, and some of them will be bigger than others. On this issue of the national health system, I sort of started reading that originally, and I thought, we have an agreement with Canada. We don't get into drug pricing in Canada. Canada has a single payer system. They buy their drugs. So what should we get out of it? We should have access to normal things that are sold anywhere in the economy in this country. And we would expect that. We should have access in the healthcare area to the extent there's private sector competition in areas. We should have access to that sort of thing. The National Health Service, that's a policy decision that citizens of the United Kingdom decided on years ago, and it's either very successful or pretty successful, depending on who you're talking to, and it's not really something that we're going to get into or change in a fundamental way. So we have the chicken problem, we have the chlorinated chicken, and we have the National Health Service. I don't think those are going to be what sinks us. But I suspect you'll probably want to come to America when you need an operation. No, I'm just kidding about that. I withdraw that comment.
We have time for one more question. Can we go to the member in the very back? Yeah, with the blonde hair, yeah.
Thank you. I was delighted to hear about your interest in ruthless pragmatism, particularly at a time when ideologies are dividing many countries and within countries. So I would just ask, given that we keep talking about the UK's approach, obviously we have the big UK-EU trade talks where ideologies have run fairly rife, what advice you would give to either side to get a successful conclusion to the trade talks?
So the question is, on camera, what advice would I give who am I giving the advice to? No, I'm kidding.
Well, both sides, both sides.
Yeah, to both sides. Be nice. The fact is you have a lot of trade back and forth, right? And the way I analyze it, from a trade point of view, it shouldn't be that hard to work it out. The question is politics, right? It's not a trade problem, it's a political problem. And I'm just, once again, I'm an outsider just trying to engage. To me, it's a political problem. The trade stuff you can work out in a hard-nosed negotiation like you always do. But the politics, the fact that people in Europe are upset that the UK left, the fact that that has an impact on other people in the European Union, that's kind of the issue, right? It really is not so much of a trade issue. That's a tough technical negotiation that'll go on. What people have to, in my judgment, is kind of get over the politics of it and realize that what we're talking about is trade, right? We're not going to solve all the problems of the world. The United Kingdom is a free and independent country, and if I were Europe, I would treat them as such, right? And they do trade agreements with a lot of people, and they should be able to get one with you guys, not without difficulty. They're all tough. I mean, these trade negotiations are tough and they're complicated, and but if you minimize the political poison in the system, you'll probably get there quicker. I guess that's my advice. I don't know. Presumably no one will take it, so.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but please join me in a huge thank you for this event.